This is the story called The Boys' War. Confederate and Union soldiers talk about the Civil War. We're reading chapter 8, and it's called Prison Bars and the Surgeon's Saw. We have a picture here, and it says, as troops assemble to march into battle, an ambulance crew prepares for its day's work. In order to be efficient fighters, boys in the Civil War had to put their normal fears and worries aside. This does not mean that they lost all of their emotions. Far from it. These boys worried about a great deal. Where their next meal would come from, their abilities and courage of the officers directly in charge of them, or how to get a good pair of shoes, to name a few. But there were several specific concerns that were shared by all young soldiers on both sides. One was the fear of being lost among the great crowds in which they marched and fought and died. It was not uncommon for an army of 50 or 100,000 men to look across a battlefield at an equal number of the enemy. This was nothing at all like home, where everybody knew the boys' names and faces. Here a boy was just another body, no more important than the person next to him. There are many accounts of boys separated from their companies while either marching or fighting, who spent days and weeks trying to find a familiar face. The biggest fear, however, was of being killed and not of having their bodies identified properly. This was not as odd a fear as it might seem. After a major engagement, the battlefield would be a confusing, chaotic mess. The ground would be pockmarked with hundreds of craters, the result of the ceaseless cannon and mortar fire. Bits and pieces of shattered trees, cannons, and wagons would litter the earth, while the black smoke of burning buildings and fields created a murky and choking haze. Frightened and wounded horses galloped over the landscape. Injured soldiers screamed for water or medical attention. A few wounded soldiers might be seen stumbling to find help, their shirts and pants saturated with blood, and some still clinging to a severed arm. What seeing such a sight might have felt like was captured by young Fred Grant, who had accompanied his father, Lieutenant General Ulysses S. Grant, during the siege of Vicksburg. The horrors of a battlefield were brought vividly before me. I joined a detachment which was collecting the dead for burial. Sickening at the sights, I made my way with another detachment, which was gathering the wounded, to a log house, which had been appropriated for a hospital. Here, the scenes were so terrible that I became faint. And making my way to a tree, sat down, the most woebegone 12-year-old in America. The minute the shooting stopped, the men who had just fought in the battle went hunting among the churned-up lands for their comrades living and dead. Thomas Galway did this after the Battle of Gettysburg. As for us, we have been attending our wounded and have been picking up such of our dead as we could recognize. Each regiment selects a suitable place for its dead and puts a headboard on each individual grave. They attend to this chore with much as care as they could muster. They would, after all, want the same attention paid to their remains. But it must have been nearly impossible for the exhausted soldiers. For instance, when Grant's army drove towards Richmond in the spring of 1864, it suffered more than 61,000 casualties. Confederate records have not been preserved, but the South must have had similar losses. The dead who could not be identified as well as all of the enemy dead were consigned to a mass unmarked grave. As Galway makes clear, The unrecognized dead are left to the last, to be buried in long trenches. The corpses are brought into rows and counted, the Confederate and Federals being separated into different rows. At the feet of each row of 50 or 100 dead, a trench is dug about 7 or 8 feet wide and about 3 feet deep, for there is no time for a normal grave depth. Then the bodies, which are as black as ink and bloated from exposure to the sun, are placed in the shallow ditch and quickly covered with dirt. We have a picture here, and the caption says, "A crowded Union cemetery at City Point, Virginia. Only the graves in the background have markers to identify dead soldiers and their regiments." Thousands of soldiers would die alone and be buried without proper religious services and in shallow graves. No one would ever know how they died, and no one would ever be able to visit their place of burial. They would be lost forever. No wonder that the Confederate soldier E.D. Patterson worried more about home than about the wounds he suffered. "I thought of home far away. I wondered if my fate would ever be known to them. I had a horror of dying alone. I was afraid that none of my regiment would ever find me, and that with the unknown dead who lay scattered around me, I would be buried in one common ground. The thought was terrible. How I longed for a day, just that someone would see me die."